"Nurse, please clear the bay. We need people in here who can move. Go handle intake." The voice of Dr. Aris Caldwell was not unkind, but it was layered with the dismissive finality of a man who had no time for debate. He was young, sharp, and his confidence filled the trauma bay like the sterile antiseptic air. He gestured with a latex-gloved hand toward the chaos of the emergency room waiting area, a clear indication that her utility had ended at this threshold. Evelyn Reed simply nodded, her gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on the patient, a multi-car pileup victim, before she turned. The movement was slow, deliberate, dictated by the stubborn protest of her left leg. The limp wasn't pronounced, but it was permanent, a slight drag and dip that broke the rhythm of a normal stride. It was the first thing people like Dr. Caldwell noticed, and usually the last thing they cared to look past. She retreated from the high-stakes theater of Trauma Bay 1, her worn light blue scrubs seeming to fade into the frantic background of the ER. Her face, etched with lines that spoke more of long nights than long years, was a mask of placid composure. She didn't feel the sting of dismissal. She was too busy listening to the symphony of crisis around her, the frantic beeping of a heart monitor, the strained pitch of a resident calling for a crash cart, the thin wail of a frightened child. Her eyes, a pale and watchful gray, swept the room not with a casual glance but with a practiced, systematic scan. It was a habit forged in a place far louder and more dangerous than this. She saw the vectors of movement, the bottlenecks near the nurse's station, the rising panic in a young intern's expression. Dr. Caldwell saw an old, slow nurse. Evelyn saw a system on the verge of collapsing under pressure. Evelyn made her way to the intake desk, the epicenter of the ER's frantic energy. The charge nurse, a harried woman named Brenda, gave her a sympathetic look. "Don't mind Aris," she said, not looking up from her screen. "He's got a god complex and the attention span of a gnat. Thinks anyone over 40 is a medical fossil." Evelyn offered a small, non-committal smile and picked up a clipboard. The task was simple. Take names, basic symptoms, insurance information. It was a job for a volunteer, not a registered nurse with decades of experience, but she performed it with the same quiet diligence she applied to everything. As she worked, her body remained a study in contradiction. The limp was a clear sign of physical compromise, yet her posture was ramrod straight, her shoulders squared in a way that suggested they had once borne heavy loads. Her hands, when she took a pen or adjusted her glasses, were unnaturally steady. There was a fine silvery scar that traced the extensor tendon on the back of her right hand, a delicate line against her weathered skin. She spoke to the incoming patients with a profound calm, her voice low and even, cutting through their fear and pain. She wasn't just collecting data, she was performing a constant, subtle triage. Her eyes would assess a patient's skin color, their breathing rate, the way they held themselves. She'd place a gentle hand on a wrist, ostensibly for comfort, but her fingers would be finding a pulse, judging its rate and quality. More than once, she quietly repositioned a waiting patient from a chair to a gurney, or had a tech grab a basin for someone whose pallor she didn't like, all without raising an alarm or disrupting the established flow. She was a ghost, operating in the margins, her expertise rendered invisible by the assumptions of those in charge. The first hint that the night was about to shatter came not as a shout, but as a series of electronic tones. A multi-line alert chimed across the hospital's pager system, a sound that made every seasoned medical professional freeze for a half second. Brenda's head snapped up. "MCI," she breathed, her eyes wide. "Level 1, tour bus rollover on the interstate." The words hung in the air for a moment, a prophecy of the deluge to come. Then, the ER erupted. Dr. Caldwell's voice rose above the din, sharp and commanding, directing teams, calling for surgeons to be put on standby, demanding every available bed be cleared. He was a general preparing for battle, and in this, he was good. He was decisive, knowledgeable, and moved with an energy that inspired action. The relative chaos of a busy Friday night transformed into the disciplined pandemonium of a mass casualty incident. The automatic doors slid open and the first wave hit. Paramedics wheeled in gurneys in a grim parade, their voices tight with urgency as they rattled off vitals and injuries. Broken bones, lacerations, internal bleeding, head trauma. The air grew thick with the metallic scent of blood and the raw sound of human suffering. Evelyn was supposed to stay at intake, to be the gatekeeper, but the gate had been obliterated. The tide of wounded flowed past her, filling every available space in the hallways, the waiting room becoming a makeshift treatment area. She watched Dr. Caldwell's team, efficient as they were, become utterly overwhelmed. They were focusing, correctly, on the most critical red tag patients in the trauma bays, but that meant dozens of others, the yellow tags, were left waiting, their conditions potentially deteriorating. Evelyn abandoned the now useless intake desk. No one ordered her to. No one noticed she was gone. She moved into the controlled storm, her limp a steady, rhythmic counterpoint to the frantic scissoring of younger legs. She grabbed a triage kit from a supply cart and began to work. She wasn't infringing on Caldwell's authority. She was operating in the spaces he couldn't see. She found a teenage boy, pale and shivering in a hallway, his arm wrapped in a hastily applied bandage that was already soaked through. His friends, also injured, were trying to comfort him. Evelyn's eyes immediately saw the bright arterial pump of the blood. She knelt, her bad knee protesting silently, and her steady hands went to work. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice a bubble of calm in the noise. Jake, he stammered. "It's okay, Jake. We're going to fix this." She cut away the bandage with a pair of shears she produced from her pocket. The wound was deep, a nasty gash from a piece of twisted metal. Without a word, she applied a tourniquet high on his bicep, pulling it tight with an expert single motion and marking the time on his forehead with a grease pencil. The bleeding stopped instantly. The young interns rushing by were focused on IV lines and oxygen masks. They had missed the life-threatening bleed. Evelyn saw it, handled it, and moved on. A few feet away, a woman was hyperventilating, her panic contagious. Evelyn knelt beside her, making eye contact. "Breathe with me," she said softly, demonstrating a slow, controlled cadence. "In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. You're in control." The woman's ragged gasps slowly began to even out. Evelyn was a calming agent, a force of order moving silently through the chaos, her decades of experience a resource no one had thought to tap. Then came the patient who would change the entire dynamic of the night. Two paramedics burst through the doors, their faces grim, muscling a gurney that seemed to carry more medical equipment than person. Male, mid-20s, ejected from the secondary vehicle. Multiple fractures, massive internal hemorrhaging, GCS of 5. "We lost his pulse twice on the way in," they shouted. The man on the gurney was wearing the tattered remains of a USMC t-shirt. Dr. Caldwell and his best team converged on Trauma Bay 2, the sense of urgency ratcheting up to a fever pitch. "Get me trauma labs, O-neg blood, and page ortho and neuro now," Caldwell commanded. From her position in the hallway, Evelyn could see the readings on the monitor as they wheeled him past. They were catastrophic. His blood pressure was circling the drain, his heart rate erratic. She saw the distended abdomen, the unnatural angle of his leg, but something else caught her eye, a subtle but definite swelling on one side of his neck, the jugular vein standing out like a taut rope. It was a sign so easily missed amid the more dramatic visible injuries. She watched as Caldwell's team worked on him, a whirlwind of efficient textbook procedures. They pushed fluids, hung blood, intubated him. But the numbers on the monitor kept getting worse. "He's crashing!" a resident yelled. "No pulse, starting compressions." The rhythmic thumping of CPR began, a desperate drumbeat against the backdrop of beeping alarms. Caldwell's face was a mask of intense concentration, but a flicker of frustration, of defeat was beginning to show in his eyes. They were losing him. Evelyn moved. Her limp seemed to vanish, replaced by a forward-driving purpose that parted the sea of bodies in the ER. She entered Trauma Bay 2, her presence a sudden quiet intrusion into the high-octane crisis. "Stop compressions," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a quality of command that made the resident performing CPR pause instinctively. Dr. Caldwell spun around, his face flushed with anger and adrenaline. "Nurse, I told you to get out of here." "Security!" he roared, his control finally snapping. "You're contaminating my bay and obstructing my team." Evelyn's gaze never wavered from the patient. "You're missing it," she said, her voice still level. "Look at his neck, Tracheal deviation. He has a tension pneumothorax. The CPR is useless. You're just pushing air into his chest cavity and crushing his heart." She pointed a steady finger. "You need to decompress his chest, now." For a moment, there was stunned silence. A tension pneumothorax was a classic deadly injury, but in a patient with so many other massive traumas, it could be easily masked. Caldwell stared at her, his ego warring with the sudden chilling possibility that this old nurse was right. "That's speculative," he stammered, unwilling to cede authority. "We don't have time for—" "Get me a 14-gauge needle and a betadine swab," Evelyn said, her voice hardening, taking on an edge of steel that no one in that hospital had ever heard before. She wasn't asking. It was an order. The younger nurse next to her, caught between two opposing forces, instinctively moved toward the supply cart. Just as the standoff reached its breaking point, the main doors of the ER slid open with a violent whoosh. A group of men filed in, their presence instantly changing the atmosphere of the entire room. They were Marines, 4 of them, in their duty uniforms. They moved with a disciplined intensity that made the hospital chaos seem disorganized and soft. They weren't wounded. They were on a mission. At their head was a gunnery sergeant, a man whose face was a roadmap of hard places and harder decisions. His eyes, sharp and assessing, scanned the room, taking in the scene with a glance. "We're looking for one of ours," he announced, his voice a low rumble that carried effortlessly over the noise. "Staff Sergeant Miller. He was in the pileup." A nurse pointed shakily toward Trauma Bay 2. The gunnery sergeant, Marcus Gallo, started forward, his men falling in behind him. They moved with the fluid economy of a fire team, creating their own path. Their eyes were fixed on the gurney, on the desperate fight for their brother's life. Then, Gunny Gallo's gaze shifted. He saw Dr. Caldwell, red-faced and yelling. He saw the frantic work of the residents, and then he saw the quiet, gray-haired nurse with the limp standing at the center of it all. His entire body went rigid. The forward momentum ceased. The hard lines on his face dissolved, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock, followed by something that looked like reverence. The other Marines stopped with him, sensing the sudden shift in their leader. The ER faded into a muffled hum for Gallo. He stared at Evelyn, his mouth slightly agape. The other Marines looked from their gunny to the old woman, confused. "Ma'am," Gallo finally managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes locked on her face, searching, confirming. He saw the calm in her eyes, the set of her jaw, the unnerving stillness of her hands. He saw the faint silvery scar on her right hand. His breath hitched. "Mercy 6?" he asked, the name an invocation, a piece of forgotten lore spoken aloud. The name hung in the air, electric and heavy. It meant nothing to the doctors and nurses, just 2 strange words. But to the other 3 Marines, it was like a lightning strike. Their training, their discipline, their very bearing snapped into a different configuration. Their backs straightened. Their gazes, which had been filled with worry for their friend, now fixed on Evelyn with a look of profound, almost fearful respect. One of the younger Marines, a lance corporal, actually took a half-step back, as if in the presence of a monument. Dr. Caldwell stared, bewildered. "What did you call her? Who is this woman?" "She's a staff nurse, and she's out of line." Gunny Gallo turned his head slowly to face Caldwell, and the look in his eyes was ice. "Doctor," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you have no idea who you're talking to." Gallo turned his attention back to Evelyn, his posture one of complete deference. He spoke to the assembled medical staff, but his words were for her, an offering of validation. 30 years ago, in places that don't officially exist, there were legends. Stories you'd hear whispered from one firebase to another. Stories about a medic who was more than a medic. They called her Mercy. She was attached to a Tier 1 unit, a ghost who went where they went. His voice was low, filled with an awe that silenced the entire room. The beeping monitors seemed to fade away. She wasn't a nurse, doctor. She was a surgeon, one of the best. But she operated in the field, in the dark, under fire, with whatever she had. They say she once performed a thoracotomy with a K-bar and used a Zippo for light. They say she held a severed artery closed with her bare hands for 2 hours on a helicopter ride out of a hot LZ. He gestured with his chin toward Evelyn's leg. "That limp?" That's from RPG shrapnel she took while dragging 3 unconscious operators out of a burning vehicle. She stabilized all 3 of them before she allowed anyone to look at her own leg. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. She was the team leader, the final word on every casualty. That's why we called her Mercy 6. 6 is the call sign for a commander. She didn't just save lives, she commanded death to stand down. And it listened. A profound, bottomless silence descended on Trauma Bay 2. Dr. Caldwell stared at Evelyn, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the ramrod posture, the impossibly steady hands, the assessing eyes that missed nothing. He saw the quiet confidence that he had mistaken for the slowness of age. It wasn't slowness, it was efficiency. It was the economy of movement learned in places where a wasted motion could get you killed. His arrogance crumbled, replaced by a wave of cold, sickening shame. He had dismissed a living legend. He had ordered a hero to go handle paperwork. The other nurses and residents looked at Evelyn with wide, disbelieving eyes, their understanding of the world tilting on its axis. The unimpressive limping nurse was a warrior, a commander, a figure of battlefield myth made flesh and blood. But Evelyn, Mercy 6, paid them no mind. The past was the past. The only thing that mattered was the dying Marine on the table in front of her. She had already taken the 14-gauge needle from the stunned nurse's hand. She turned to the now humbled Dr. Caldwell. "Doctor," she said, her voice devoid of triumph or accusation. It was the voice of a teacher. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. "You need to be precise." She didn't perform the procedure herself. She placed the needle in his hand, guiding his fingers to the correct position on the Marine's chest. "Now," she commanded softly. With trembling hands, Caldwell pushed the needle in. There was an audible hiss of escaping air. On the monitor, the alarms began to quiet. The erratic heart rate started to stabilize. The blood pressure, which had been non-existent, began to creep back up. A pulse returned. Color started to seep back into the Marine's ashen face. Evelyn had not only diagnosed the problem, she had forced the arrogant doctor to be part of the solution, restoring his purpose while asserting her undeniable authority. The room, which had been a crucible of chaos, was now a cathedral of quiet, focused work, all of it revolving around the calm, limping woman who was more than she appeared. She was Mercy 6, and she was home.